bandwidth for the Hauger History Podcast, graciously donated by podbean.com.
This is the Hauger History Podcast, a free resource for middle school students around the world. Subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/DannyHauger, Hauger, or on iTunes at the Hauger History Podcast. Take your seats. Class is about to begin.
And now, the teacher that puts rhetorical in the question. Here he is, Mr. Hauger.
So weird. All right, welcome to the Hauger History Podcast. Try to introduce myself once again. The pitch shift just made it weird, but not weird enough to change. So here we are on a special 7th grade edition of the Hauger History Podcast. Thanks for joining us. I am Mr. Hauger, and I'm ready to get started with some Renaissance vocabulary for all students out there who are reviewing key concepts, getting ready for an assessment, quiz, or just reinforcing their knowledge about the Renaissance. I've got a PowerPoint slideshow that will be put up on DannyHauger.com that you can use to follow along with this audio resource as well. You're going to be given a word bank if you're in my classroom with about 15 or 20 words, and we're going to have a vocabulary test. And more than that, bringing the Renaissance to life is vibrantly important for students to really gain interest and grasp concepts and enjoy learning as well. So my students are going to be given a choose-your-own-adventure type project, where they're given 15 choices and many different ways of approaching it that they will choose with a partner. Some of those include preparing a mural, diary entries of a famous person, making a short film, writing a conversation or a scene with two famous figures, making a comic strip, a picture book, a physical model, bumper sticker series, a game, an animation. And I'm going to be putting that up on Teachers Pay Teachers and on my website at DannyHauger.com. So you can check into that relatively soon for the latest updates on how that's going. But your vocabulary encourages you to get involved in a different way and develop some kind of performance or creation based on the important terms of the chapter. In this podcast today, we're going to run through 10 of the most significant terms, as well as how they connect to history. Let's get started. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter at Hauger History and request episodes in the future. You can't talk about the Renaissance without talking about business. The ideas of trades, the increase of goods and cultural diffusion that came across the Middle East and Europe via the Silk Road and the opening up of the East that made it possible for the export of greater goods and the import of not just goods but ideas. So for the first time, Europeans are gaining large-scale access to ideas and faiths and goods from India, China, and across the Middle East as well. That's happening along the Silk Road. Those were extremely important and significant for the connection of ideas and flow of a Renaissance. It's a French word that means French and from France, a France. Another coined term here, hashtag France, on the Hauger History Podcast. The Renaissance comes from a French word meaning rebirth. The time period that we're discussing is following the medieval period from 1300 to 1600 AD or CE, Common Era. One of the first terms, although you could easily spend a dozen days going over a dozen top Renaissance artists, especially when we talk about the influence of some of the most significant figures in creative history. Michelangelo, let's start with the David. Notice I didn't say Michelangelo, and he's not an orange bandana wearing turtle. He created his masterpiece, the David, in 1504, also a little project called the Sistine Chapel, and so much more than that. But the things you want to know are the highlights, then that's enough for you. But of course, I always encourage my students to dive a little bit deeper. And I'm going to ask them each to pick one of their favorite artists or one they don't know much about. Dive deeper and show us a little report or presentation. Nothing in depth, nothing that's going to make them turn away from the material, just to simply enhance their material. Continuing on, Leonardo Da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, famous painter, sculptor, architect, and engineer. And that's one of the things I love, the term Renaissance man, someone who is involved in the creative aspects of many different fields. I'm going to continue before I discuss more about that near the end of this episode. Chateaus. We moved in class and spent a day and a half going through Google Earth on our smartboard in the classroom. Each student was allowed to come to the board, show us a place that they visited, and then try to distinguish one determining factor that made each region or country participating in the Renaissance unique. And there is not just one for each country, but starting out with a few distinguishing factors that are unique to a particular culture, place, or time. Chateaus in France. As cities expanded and grew richer with trade and business, France began to have greater development in the countryside, and the castles and dwellings were large and grand. There was an architectural shift And the characteristic castles and mansions that we know of today as very French or very France are called chateaus. So that's a term that we introduced when we discussed France. Although you could talk about critiques of politics, modern day, literature, art, we were focusing on architecture in France. Okay, so we moved on and we talked about Gutenberg and the printing press. I drew this chain of events in my PowerPoint slideshow. Said more books being able to be printed meant that more readers would learn to read, because there was a wider availability of materials. Back then, if you weren't a member of the clergy or in some power in the church, you probably weren't going to need to read, and you weren't going to have very many materials on which to practice. But more books led to more readers, which led to more thinking and more critical thinking, which led to more creativity, which led to more writing, which led to more books, which led to more readers thinking and more creative writing and responses. And you get it, right? I mean, right? Do I need to keep going? Gutenberg's printing press cannot be understated in its significance and its importance in the Renaissance. Now it's your turn. There's way more to the Renaissance than a traditional PowerPoint could cover, and you should be able to explore and choose your own project as well. So I suggest in your classrooms, maybe bring it up to a teacher, that you choose your own adventure and find your own project, like an advertisement, a political cartoon, a skit, an animation, or create another idea to explore these concepts. There's so much going on. And I just want to summarize the Renaissance by discussing a few historical perspectives that we discussed in our 7th grade classroom. Number 1, historians disagree on the significance of the Renaissance. Did it really get down to grassroots and affect those who are the common person? Or was it simply something that affected the rich and wealthy, where patrons were able to sponsor famous artists, to contract them for famous works, to show how famous they were, and to enhance the lives of the rich and wealthy by being able to show off the creative music, art, design, architecture, and paintings of some of the great minds and creatives? To this I say, the Renaissance, for me, is a link to modern history. We don't ever get to a point where we can think and develop and criticize and gain the ideas from the classical period and innovate and improve on them if we don't take time to explore, even if it's a selective number of people, and to develop humanistic ideas. Humanism, the idea that people's creations and engagements and creativity is something that we should be honored and reflective and advance upon, as well as the views of nature and appreciating the world around us. It expanded a lot the considerations of more things than just religious aspects during the Renaissance period. So I think these things are all extremely significant. Shakespeare in England, obviously becoming one of the most significant playwrights in history, although we know that he might have adapted and innovated or borrowed without asking some other materials. And the same may be true with recent discoveries that Da Vinci's creations, while he took them much further and went into much greater depth in his innovations and his plans and his writing to make them realistic, a lot of the earlier writers and creators had developed ideas, and we know that his mentor had access to those particular routes of getting that information. So, it's a mixed bag like all of history, but the increase in literacy, the increase in artistic visions of nature, and the common man becoming more accurate and realistic in displays, to me links us to another century and huge gain in human history. And that's about a good note to end on as any. Don't forget, you can leave us a comment at youtube.com/Danny Hauger on any Hauger history video. You can request your own episode, and that's about it for now. So push in your chairs. Good luck on your vocabulary tests in the Renaissance, and send any questions along on Twitter as well, at Hauger History. We'll see you next time. I'm Mr. Hauger saying be good out there. Stay dry, January weather. No matter when you're listening to this, look out for January weather. Okay, see you later. Bye.